Well, hello, everybody, and happy Friday, and welcome to the 92nd episode of Stories of Service, Ordinary People Who Do Extraordinary Work. And I'm the host of Stories of Service, Teresa Carpenter. And today we have another amazing guest. We always have amazing guests on the show, but we have Mr. Scott Mann. Scott, how are you doing today?
Hey, thanks for having me on.
I'm so blessed and glad to have this opportunity to talk to you. You're the first person that I've been able to have the conversation that I've been wanting to have about Afghanistan, about moral injury. We're going to get into mental health, just so many things. But first off, I'm just going to give my audience, for who is not familiar with your story, just the brief background. And for those who are listening through the audio version of the podcast, it always helps to have this little intro here. So Scott Mann, he wears many hats, and he really shows us what stepping up and making an impact looks like. He shares his inspiring story on numerous stages and the stories of other warriors, primarily right now through his play, but through his leadership company, many media engagements, including tier one national media engagements. He's been doing quite a few of those lately, through his book and even advocacy, most recently, I think this past spring in Congress. And it's just amazing to see somebody who's such a change agent and who really personifies what this show is really all about, which is people who are not afraid to speak up and speak out. So Lieutenant Colonel retired Scott Mann is a former U.S. Army Green Beret with tours all over the world, including Colombia, Iraq, and multiple tours in Afghanistan. He is a warrior storyteller and the founder of Rooftop Leadership, where he shares the rapport-building skills he learned in special forces to help today's leaders make better human connections in high-stakes, low-trust engagements. He is the author of the instant New York Times bestseller Operation Pineapple Express, which is a third-person narrative detailing the harrowing stories of the veterans, volunteers, and Afghan allies who navigated the U.S. abandonment of Afghanistan in August of 2021. And now the Gary Sinise Foundation has also partnered with Scott to bring his play Last Out, Elegy of a Green Beret, to the legendary theater Steppenwolf, as well as in stages across the country. And if you follow anything about what Scott's doing right now, you'll see many of his postings in the various states where he's putting the show on, as well as stages across the country in an effort to provide healing to our veterans and families of the fallen, and providing insight to our citizens on the personal cost of the longest war in our nation's history. Welcome again, Scott.
Hey, thanks, Teresa.
So first off, as I ask all of my guests who are associated with the military, what inspired you to make a career within the armed forces?
I grew up in a little logging town in Arkansas. We didn't even have a stoplight. Very small town, and met a Green Beret, active duty Green Beret named Mark when I was 14. He was there visiting family, and the minute I met this guy, I knew that's what I wanted to do and wanted to be. You know, I think for a lot of us, when we meet someone who influences us or who inspires us, it's oftentimes how they carry themselves and who they are as individuals before we even know what they do. And that was certainly the case with me when I met Mark, and when he explained to me what Green Berets were about and the kind of work they do by, with, and through indigenous populations, and helping the little guy stand up against the big guy. For me, that's what resonated so much, because as a runt, as a kid that had moved around a lot and was always on the outside looking in, that really landed with me.
Wow. So that was something that was within you to go for that and to do that kind of a job. When you initially came into the armed services, were you a Green Beret right away, or did you? I'm not sure how the special forces work in the Army. Was it something that you had to transition to after doing something previously?
Yeah, it was something that, like a lot of some of the elite forces, you can go into right out of high school, and there
Mhm.
is a pathway for that in special forces as well. What I would say is that, first of all, is that Green Berets are different than every elite unit is unique in its own way. But Green Berets are different in that, they work by, with, and through indigenous people. So I kind of tell people that a modern day Green Beret is a combination of John Wick, Lawrence of Arabia, and the Verizon guy. I mean, they are relationship based connectors who happen to be lethal, but only when it's necessary. And what it implies is a level of rapport building skills and interpersonal skills that it takes a while to kind of develop that. So in the special forces community, typically you have to do an assignment in the regular Army before you're eligible to try out.
Mhm.
As an officer, that was certainly the case for me. I wasn't eligible to try out until I was a captain. So I had done 3 or 4 years in Panama waiting for that opportunity to do it. And in the process of that, I went to Ranger School and Air Assault School and schools that would help me get ready. And I failed every single one of them twice in that journey. And just, I think part of being a runt and trying to get through what were very difficult schools. And that probably taught me as much about life as anything was when you get recycled in a school and just the humiliation and morale kick that comes from that is, how do you keep going? And that's kind of been my journey all the way up until Special Forces was, I think I did every course required for it twice.
I can totally relate. I was held back in aircrew school when I first initially joined the services because I couldn't do the swim strokes right. Then I got held back as in the helo dunker portion of the school because I couldn't figure out how to turn over upside down, underwater, blindfolded, and get my way out. And so I was held back a week there. So I can definitely relate to that. And I think that's really part of what I think builds your character. Are those crucible moments where like the only way you're going to get through this is if you dig deep and dig hard, or everything that you set out to do to go to that school and to get that Ranger tab, or in my case, my aircrew pin, is null and void. And so you really want to do it. And that's one of the wonderful things I think that service teaches us is that persistence and that ability to keep going. Would you agree?
100%. I mean, how bad do you want it? How much of it is truly a dream, and what length are you willing to go to? What a buddy of mine, Bo Eason, he says, every dream has a cost. There's a transaction that must be paid for every dream. And I have 3 boys now that are grown, and I told them that their entire life growing up, and they're seeing it now. Each of them is chasing their dreams. And wow, Dad, you're right, man. There's a penance to be paid, and there is. I mean, if you're going to play that bigger game, to do the stuff that scares you, then there's going to be those moments where everything falls apart, and you really have to just dig in and figure out what you're going to do in that moment. And I know for me, it was the pathway to being a Green Beret that really prepared me for life more than I ever thought it would.
I think that's fascinating. And you said this in a previous podcast that I just listened to that you were on, about how 3 times a year you get this like tap, or you think about like there's these moments, and sometimes you take them and do something about it, and sometimes you don't. And that's kind of what those moments remind me of, is when something is kicking your ass so hard, do you dig in deeper and keep going, or is that a sign, even if you fail, that there's some other path meant for you? So sometimes you don't know which path is the right path either, because some people who wash out of these schools end up in some other career that was better off for them anyway, So It's just kind of fascinating how that works out.
It's really true. And it's a great way to put it into perspective. And in Rooftop Leadership, we do consider a major component of that methodology to be the tap on the shoulder. And, Winston Churchill coined that term when he talked about how each of us in our life will be figuratively tapped on the shoulder, and what a tragedy it would be if we found ourselves ill prepared for that moment. And I to me, that just resonates so well. And a buddy of mine who was an Olympic coach and Olympic athlete named Jeff, he took that a step further. And he said that, he actually did research on this, that every single human in their life each year will receive what he coins a pivotal moment. There'll be a pivotal moment that happens where it's strategic. Like there is an inflection point in your journey that is strategic. And the question is, are you open enough to hear it, to receive it, to respond to it? And as you said, it's difficult because oftentimes it presents itself as a butt kicking, as something that you didn't want, or you thought you didn't want. And are you open enough to actually see it for what it is? My wife, Monty, is phenomenal at taking moments like that and flipping them on their head and saying, okay, what is this really about? And I think all of us could aspire to do that more, because on the other side of that are these strategic opportunities that, are profound.
Right. Truly, truly, truly. So as you're going along your journey in the Army as a Green Beret, tell me a little bit about what that experience was like and what you walked away from. I know you did tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. You were involved in our longest war, and tell me a little bit about what that experience and those period of years sort of made you who you are today. I want to sort of get into how this got you on the journey of the rooftop leadership, then into the play, then into the advocacy. So what was it sort of during those years that you think started putting you on that path?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I would say that special forces definitely shaped me in just about every way imaginable. The first 10 years, 8 years of my career in special forces was at Fort Bragg and 7th Special Forces Group. And as an officer, I served as a detachment commander of a 12-person A team. As a company commander there, I was a company commander twice, and then also in various staff positions. And I loved, not only did I love being a Green Beret and loved being a Special Forces officer, I loved 7th Group. You know, there are 5 Special Forces groups in the world, and each of them is, and then there's 2 National Guard groups. But each of those groups is regionally apportioned. It's regionally oriented. And I had already spent 3 years in Panama as a lieutenant. So I knew I wanted to be in 7th Group because they were focused. This was all pre 9/11. This was like 1995 or 6. I'll date myself there. But they were oriented on Central and South America. And at the time, you know, the drug war in the Andean Ridge was raging. It was just a few years after Pablo had been killed. And 7th Group was very involved in counterinsurgency, counter narcotics work all throughout Latin America, and had been really for decades. And if Colombia, for example, the longest running insurgency in the world with the FARC, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarios de Colombia, they've been an active insurgent for like 60 years. And so where I'm going with that was I had the opportunity as a young Green Beret to go downrange with these iconic Special Forces warrant officers and NCOs who had been in special forces, like in that group, in that battalion, in some cases on the same team for like 15 years. They had these deep relationships with the Fuerzas Especiales in Colombia, that where they could walk into the Colombian Pentagon, an E8, and sit down with the head of the Colombian army because they had trained him as a lieutenant.
Wow.
And so the depth of their relationships, their ability to influence things at a strategic level because of relationships, because of social capital. We call it foreign internal defense, going in and you know, dealing with insurgency and lawlessness. But it was all relationship based. And to be a part of that, Teresa, to experience that and to see how one deployment at a time, the ball was moved just 5 yards down the field and handed off to the next team. And there was such a reverence for the relationships with those partner nations that shaped me and carried me into into the 9/11, the second half of my career, when that horrific attack occurred. And those 5 groups then became completely myopically focused on Iraq and Afghanistan, and Afghanistan became my focus. But it was what I learned in those by, with, and through situations down south that shaped everything I did inside Afghanistan.
But did you feel, as I've talked to Amy Forsythe, she was a public affairs officer who deployed multiple times in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I don't think that she felt, and a lot of other veterans have told me who've served there, did you think you could have the impact that you wanted to have there? Or were there political barriers that you didn't experience when you were working in South America?
First of all, Amy's amazing. She is
Yeah.
one of the coolest leaders I know. Like, I just have such a profound respect for her. Monty and I both do. You know, that's an interesting question. I would say, first of all, I made a ton of mistakes in Afghanistan, like personally, like as a leader, as a Green Beret. You know, I went into Afghanistan on the heels of my Ranger buddy Cliff being killed in the Pentagon and on 9/11. And so that right out of the gate, you know, not only was I angry about what had happened on our watch, but it was fueled by the personal loss of a very, very dear friend of mine. I mean, we had named our firstborn kids Cody, like that's how close we were. And when Monty told me that he had been killed, I wasn't able to deploy into Afghanistan until 2004. But at that point, I had lost Cliff and several other friends, and I was seething for payback. And a lot of us were. And so I believe, as a special forces community, kind of got away from our roots after the initial OEF1, where we were on horseback and doing the unconventional warfare. I believe we kind of devolved into a targeting element where we were walking down the enemy yes, we had beards, but we were very much direct action, very kinetic, and very focused on attriting the Taliban leadership. And I was participatory in that, I have to say. And I believe that we squandered, not that the work wasn't heroic and necessary, but at a strategic level, I believe we squandered an opportunity to work at the community village level with the rural Afghan leaders to help them stand up on their own on the heels of a very successful OEF1. And it wasn't just, it was the whole coalition. I believe we tried to replicate a counterinsurgency strategy from Vietnam and just lay it right on top of Afghanistan, this top-down approach of projecting security and governance and economic development in a way that was not in step with a status tribal society.
Okay.
And so in doing that, we tried to project a square peg into a round hole. And so Amy's comment in that context, absolutely. I believe that we were inhibited from really working at a local level and working from the bottom up, which I believe would have worked. And we started doing that in 2010 with a program called Village Stability Operations, but it was too late. Those first 5-8 years of the Afghanistan war were the time for that. And I have to say, for my part in it, I was not doing that. I was focused on walking the enemy down, on surgical targeting. A lot of us were. And so I have to look myself in the mirror and say, okay, there were certainly mistakes made above me, but I made my share of them too.
Right. And really, I mean, we were all a group marching to the same beat of a strategic direction as a military. So I think that, yes, individually, you can look at yourself and say, well, I made a mistake. But at the same time, you were part of a larger machine who had been ordered to perform the operation in that way. But it's interesting you say that, because you're basically saying that if we had gone in there with more of a tribal mindset of how their governance works, maybe we could have made more progress. Do you think we also could have made more progress if we had kept people in country longer? I've always wondered about the rotations,
right?
Because relationships are so hard. And so to have people come in on just rotational deployments and build relationships, how was that ever difficult to do? Because people are like, well, your group's going to leave, then the new group's going to come in. How were you able to maintain that continuity?
It was hard. And, there's a lot of different contributors to this thing that we can look back on, and we should. Rand wrote a book called Beyond the High Five. My friend Todd was an author on it, but it really talked about what you just talked about, the 6-month and the 1-month rotations, where you would come in there as a cohort, you would do your time, and then you would hand off and rotate out. And often, you had, certainly in the special forces and the special operations realm, you had guys and girls with 13, 14 deployments. But the problem was they were oftentimes in different locations. So a special forces A team that was in Maywand district on one deployment in the South is now working in the East on the next deployment. So that in the Special Forces Command had this thing called the Special Forces Playbook. It was the most asinine thing I'd ever seen, but it was designed to just get different teams in the rotations. But what it did not look at, Teresa, was the continuity of engagement that was an advantage for us if we went back to the same district, if you at least went back to the same region. And because if you're working, for example, if you are working in the South and you're in Kandahar and you are working with, Poplazai tribes, that is radically different than working with the Gilzai tribes in the East. I mean, you might as well be in a different country, right? And we did not appreciate that and understand that at a special forces level. And we're supposed to. We're supposed to be the ones that understand that fundamentally, and then I think set the tone for the rest of the military to follow on that. We did not do that, and that's my point. And again, it's not in a finger pointing way. I was participatory in it, but if we're really going to look at what happened in this 20-year war and responsibly learn from it,
Right. And that's kind of where I'm driving at.
yeah, then I think we have to step back and go, all right, for example, Afghanistan is largely a status society. And by that, I mean, it is honor-based. It's based on honor and shame. It is built around the group dynamic where it is essentially primal and tribal. The second you go off any paved road in that country, it is not the central government top down. It is the local jirga or shura bottom up that determines not just security, but economic development and even dispute resolution and governance. We did not get deep on that and understand that with true fidelity as a special forces community until 2010.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that's the case, then the rest of the coalition never did. And
Right.
so we pursued a policy and a strategy that was largely based on vengeance, payback, and retribution in the beginning. And we never got clear at a high level on what we were there to do. I think if we had just stayed focused on keeping terrorism at bay and not letting that country become a safe haven, again, that there is a way we could have done long-term foreign internal defense in that country, similar to what we've done in Colombia for 100 years, usefully. And it would have taken 100 years to move that country in a direction to where it could stand on its own.
That's fascinating. I never heard it explained like that. You have such a way of kind of simplifying a very complex concept down to the essential parts that I think anybody, even who hasn't been to Afghanistan or who may not understand the historical context, can understand. And I think this is such an important conversation because if we don't learn from what happened in Afghanistan, or we don't learn from what happened in Iraq, and let's transition to Iraq. I asked Amy the same question. I said, why do we see Iraq and Afghanistan so differently? Is it just because of that public withdrawal? Why is it that we always talk about our allies in Afghanistan, but during that same period, we were having this war in Iraq. And so why is Iraq seen so differently? And why isn't it the issue that we are seeing with Afghanistan?
I think there was, for starters, at a high level, I think there was generally more agreement within the nation and within the military and within, frankly, the diplomacy and development sectors that Afghanistan was necessary, right? I mean, we had just suffered a horrendous attack at the hands of a terror group that was planning, projecting, and launching out of Afghanistan. So in that sense, it was very hard to find. I mean, and look at the level of NATO countries and other countries that joined that effort right out of the gate. So, I mean, it was almost a no-brainer that we needed to go do that. It was after we pushed the Al-Qaeda and Taliban out that we actually started, we snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, you know? Mm-hmm. But if you look at Iraq, 2003, right out of the gate, there was a lot of folks in the military that were saying, what are we doing? Like, we need all of these assets in Afghanistan right now. You had special forces teams flying daylight missions in Afghanistan because there were no special operations rotary wing aircraft because they were all in Iraq. And that's just a microcosm of the, I think, internal division that was there. And then, of course, the country was split on Iraq. The justification for going to war there did not bear up like it probably should have. And so there was a lot of split ideology on whether it was even a worthwhile endeavor. But then we were in it. And then you started to see a very profound insurgency with Al-Qaeda in Iraq that ultimately became ISIS, and a really heavy cost in terms of blood and treasure that was kind of eclipsing Afghanistan. So there was always this just dichotomy between those two campaigns, both internal and external to the world population and the military. And I think that kind of division is what led to this context. But to your point, you know, if you stop and think about it, we abandoned the Iraqi military and the police and allowed ISIS to spring up. And then we have screwed the Kurds over so many ways under Obama, under Trump. It's unfathomable how we have treated them, and we have just thrown them to the wolves. So the one thing that I kind of look at in both of these campaigns is how we treated our partners. Both of those campaigns, Iraq and Afghanistan, were inherently contingent on our ability to work by, with, and through partner nations to stand up on their own. And in both cases, we systematically abandoned those partners and left them to the wolves. And that is, to me, the part that is incorrigible, and we have to stop it.
Right. I agree. And I think that's why your message, your play, your book, just all over your advocacy is so important, because I think that Americans need to get energized about civic duty and about being a part of their community. And it doesn't necessarily mean we want a ton of people to join the war. It means that we want people to be involved in their politics on a local level, or we want them to be involved in their elections. And it's why I'm so outspoken as an active duty member about us having an opinion and being influential. I do not agree with this mentality that has persisted, and apparently it's very historic, as I've been learning, about military not being able to speak truth to power. I think the whole reason we get better and we improve as a military is so that we share our stories like you're sharing yours, and we can rise up and move the needle forward. So I think my next question will kind of go into that, is that you've probably seen the same thing, where there's not that many people like myself, active duty, who have a podcast, who are speaking the truth about their stories online. And what would you say to somebody who's afraid to do that?
You know, I watch what you do with a lot of admiration, and I really believe in what you're doing. I left the Army in 2013. I retired. I was selected for battalion command 3 times, and I turned them down all 3 times. The third time with prejudice, because I just could not. Fast forward to that community engagement program that we were talking about, village stability operations. We started it in 2010. We abandoned them in 2012, and most of them that I helped recruit, the elders were killed. And it was a foreshadowing of what was to come in the 2021 event, and it really led to the development of my play, of my book Game Changers, and ultimately my decision to leave. And I was very outspoken about what we were doing in Afghanistan within the SOCOM community, and what we had done to guys like Jim Gant, running him out of town and taking his beret away. And I just so I believe that as leaders in the military, we have an inherent obligation to speak truth to power in the context of our service, and in the context of the oath that we've taken, and what we are pursuing. It has to be responsibly balanced, obviously, with operational security and with the good order and discipline of an organization. But I fear, Teresa, that we have moved so far into groupthink. And I look at, for example, and I'll only speak to like the special operations community on this, but when I was coming up post 9/11 in the war on terror, it was pretty much understood that the general officers and their senior enlisted advisors had a camp around them. And if you wanted to advance, if you wanted to succeed in your aspirational goals as a Green Beret or whatever special operator, you'd better be in one of those camps, and you had better demonstrate the kind of loyalty that was requisite to serving that officer and that leader. And if you spoke out against that, if you demonstrated any level of disloyalty, that you were gone. And you weren't just gone from that circle of trust, you were gone from the military. And so and what that led to, I believe, is where we are now, where it's just, to me, this is just my opinion, the whole thing's just rotten to the core. It's rotten at its core, in the sense that there is such a zero defect mentality. There is such a low morale in the junior officer and NCO ranks, and such a disparity between the leaders and the led. Now, it's not a blanket statement, but it's pretty prolific. And if you don't believe me, look at the recruiting numbers, look at the retention numbers, look at the surveys, the command climate surveys that are coming out. Like, there's a problem. And I believe that at the core of it is that we're not listening to our people. Our people don't feel heard. They don't feel seen. And Afghanistan was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was the ultimate collective representation of leaders preserving their careers at the most senior level while their NCOs and junior officers worked in the day rooms, took leave, took passes, worked out of their living rooms to recover the allies that those senior officers had told us we had better take care of for 20 years. And so I know that's a long answer, but it's bad. And I think that we've got to get back to a point where we close this gap between the leaders and the led. And that means listening to leaders like yourself who have something to say.
And I think that there's more than just me out there that are wanting to share their story and wanting to speak up. But because we have such very poor policy when it comes to political activities, when it comes to personal use of social media, there are ambiguities in place right now that keep people, I feel, silent because they don't know what line they can go over or cross. And there's a running joke even among us content creators who are active duty about all depends on who your boss is. If you've got you've got good leadership, then they love what you're doing. But I mean, I was at a command just previously where my first line supervisor said, "Oh, you're going to start a podcast? Only people like Jocko do podcasts." Just very judgmental, very dismissive, very unsupportive of the show or anything that I was doing publicly online. And even had a O6 who was one of my senior raters at my last job basically tell me that if I want to make captain, I better stop doing what I do on social media. So yeah. I can see why active duty feel the way they do. But what I hope to be is somebody who shows that, yes, you can still promote if you want. It is harder, I would say, because like Andy Milburn, he just happened to have people. He's the colonel special operations that I just had on. He had, and this is what you need when you're somebody like us. You have to have enough people in your court or your corner who do believe in what you're doing and do understand that you're doing this for the greater good and not to just, piss people off or be disrespectful or just, make a stink. So I think that it's so important that we teach the active duty how to do this, how to do it respectfully, how to do it lawfully, because there is a way to do it lawfully, or we're never going to get the change. And the change, I believe, Scott, it's going to come from the veterans like yourself, but it's also, and I feel so strongly about this, it's got to come from the people on the inside. It's got to come from people who are serving presently, who, and I get emotional about this, but who are seeing the things that are wrong and they speak up and they say something. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I think there's two ways to think about this. There's folks like me on the outside who I made a decision that I could do more on the outside than on the inside for the very reasons that you are talking about. Like, I was in a place where I wanted to be heard. And so I had to make a personal decision, like I'm going to go to the outside. But I think it's interesting to just stay on that piece before I get to the inside piece, that your former boss said, only people like Jocko do that. Well, let's unpack that for a second. I don't know Jocko personally, but I look at what that guy has done. He wrote a book called Extreme Ownership, right? That talks about taking personal responsibility for what you've done. He has told the stories of his brothers in the SEAL teams and their heroism and their courage, and then parlayed that into how that can work in your life. He writes kids' books. I mean, has he made money doing it? Yeah, but last time I checked, that's okay in America to make money. But this guy to me, is a storyteller. He's someone that we should look to in our community to go, cool, man, that guy did it right. Like, we should do more of that in civil society. We need guys like Jocko leading us at home. I'm totally cool with that. But rather what we do in our own community is we look at guys, we eat our own.
We say, oh, you can only be like those people. And if you're not huge and prolific already and famous, in his mind, because he was a huge Jocko fan. It was funny because me and the supervisor had a love-hate relationship. And one of the things we would talk about constantly is podcasting. And when I started mine, he was very dismissive of it. Like, oh, it's okay to listen to other people's podcasts and be a fan. But no, Teresa, you need to go stay in your box and be in your corner. And no, you don't do things like that.
Well, to that point, I would say I was understanding that he was like anti-jockey.
No, 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 no.
Because we see that a lot too in the special forces community. We see guys that get out there in the public space, and we cut them down because they've succeeded in the public space, you know. And I think that's something we've got to stop doing as a military community. As far as like inside, fixing problems from the inside, you know, that's the only way it's going to happen. I don't know if it can. I mean, honestly, I look at what's happened with Afghanistan. There hasn't been, that I've been able to see, and if someone can correct me, please do. I haven't seen any meaningful effort, for example, in the special forces or Army special operations community to do an after action review on what happened in the final months of Afghanistan, to examine not only what went wrong, how has it impacted our by, with, and through capability in other countries, and what can we learn differently so that when we have, what about if another attack happens on the homeland, and, you know, CENTCOM themselves have said that AQ and ISIS are within 6 months of that. What if another attack happens on the homeland? We saddle everybody up and we get on those C-17s. We go back into Afghanistan because that's how short-sighted we are. Except this time it's going to be my kid and our other kids going over there, not me. And they're going to walk not into a Northern Alliance reception party like it was the first time, ready to get to work and get after the Taliban, but a pissed off commando in tattered rags and an M4 carbine that he was given a long time ago. And in the time that's transpired, he's lost his wife, he's lost his kids, he's been tortured. And now our young Green Berets are going to go in there and try to work with this guy because the nation wants retribution. Like, has anyone done any kind of after action review at a responsible level that allows us to ascertain what we're going to be walking into? To me, that's what special operators should be doing. We're not. I haven't seen any evidence of that at all. And so if that's not happening, then we're literally turning the page. We're pretending it never happened, and we're going to send our young operators into a hornet's nest, you know. And that's just one example. And that's where I really struggle to understand what, at an institutional leader at the most senior level, what the hell's happening, because that to me is enough to retire over. Like, that's right there is a violation of the special operations imperatives, of our special operations truths, and of our supposed reverence for by, with, and through and indigenous populations. Not only have we violated it and systemically abandoned them for like decades, we've now put our own regiment and our community at risk for the next one, and there's been no hot wash.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from, Scott, and it's something that is tough for me to sit on as I move forward, because I think that we all who are presently serving, we saw what happened in Afghanistan, and everybody was just, I mean, it was definitely like this collective, like you say, moral injury that everyone felt. And even as we hear, and we've talked about this before on your posts, about how even when the White House stands up and explains what happened, they do everything in the vein of, well, we got all these other people out. We got to, you know, that's all they'll do is they'll double down, and to own it. It's just, I guess it's just not politically correct to say we made mistakes or we did this. And so nobody's doing that, because that's not, you're not allowed to do that. Apparently you're not allowed, even though that goes against everything that you learn as a leader, is you own your mistakes, you know, you humble yourself, all right. Those things. If I truly do feel, Scott, that if some of our leaders would have just done that, and had those real, honest, raw conversations about, hey, we fucked up. Yeah. And this is how we're going to make it better going forward.
So true. So good, Teresa. Yeah, it's so true. And what you're saying is gold right now. And, you know, that's not just you and I saying this is what mental health professionals who do a lot of work around moral injury, and, you know, which is a violation of what one knows to be right. And whether you participated in it or whether you had to bear witness to it, they both have a profound effect on mental health. They exacerbate PTS, they exacerbate survivor's guilt, depression, and they are, I believe, right now at the root cause of a tsunami of veteran mental health, where 80,000 plus calls went into the VA hotline in March alone, the most on record, more than any point in COVID, more than any point during the Afghanistan collapse. Like, this thing is growing. And yet there's absolute silence, deafening silence from the senior leadership, not just at the political level, but in the military. And we were trained as officers, as leaders at very junior levels, that when you make a mistake, you own it. You own that mistake and you learn from it. I mean, that is the very definition of an AAR. An after action review is to look at what happened, look at what went right, look at what went wrong, and do it differently the next time. Like it, and the rules that we were taught in tactical AARs, or hot washes, I think you guys call them in the Air Force, or debriefs, but is that there's no, you set your feelings aside, you own it, you own the problem, so that you can rapidly learn and crystallize the learning and move on and do it better next time. But and then we teach our kids the same thing. We teach our kids in kindergarten. If you make a mistake, you own it, you apologize, you atone, you move forward together. We have taken all of that shit that we learned at the most junior level, and our senior leaders have dismissed all of it. And these iconic NCOs and officers, junior officers, mid-grade officers, who lived their lives that way. They lived their lives that way. They sacrificed their youth for a 20-year war, are watching this happen. And these are guys with 10, 12, 14 deployments, women too. And they're going, what just happened? What was the point? What was all this for? Did it even matter? And the very people we put our trust in, who we fought for and who we believed in, were the ones who are now silent. And I'm not just talking about the active duty ones. I'm talking about the retired flags and the retired senior enlisted advisors. To me, they should be in the public space, not necessarily pointing fingers, but just talking about this moral injury, taking whatever level of responsibility is appropriate so that we can help these men and women move forward.
Really just doing what you're doing, Scott. I mean, honestly, if they were to just come out and do what you do, which is you talk about your experience, you talk about what it was like over there, and you talk about what you could have done differently, then you talk about institutionally what you saw would have helped you. I would love those kinds of conversations, and I welcome them on my podcast, because I think that until we have those conversations and we share those stories, we're not going to move forward, and the American people are not really being given the information that they need as taxpayers to support the elected officials that will carry the water for the things that really make sense for our nation. And that's why it really does go back to what we discussed before about a return to civics and being engaged. Because if we're not engaged about the decisions that are being made, then these decisions, I believe, we're just going to, like you said, we put the Vietnam War blueprint on Afghanistan. Well, we're just going to create another Afghanistan should, let's say, Russia attack a NATO nation. I mean, who knows? Who knows if that's going to be the same formula for us to go into another conflict? And with what we've got going on right now with Ukraine, I mean, I'm at NATO right now. It is all real to us that there could be another conflict within our lifetimes. And so what are we going to do as a nation to move forward? This is such a huge and complex problem. So I'm going to backtrack and say, what can just average citizens, most of my audience are military, they're associated with the military. What are some of the first steps that people can do to get their arms around this issue?
I mean, I wrestle with that too, because it is such a gargantuan thing. But I would just say, for starters, I think we have to articulate, we have to lead up. Because as I look around, nobody else is coming. Nobody else is coming. I don't see anything coming down the hill on the white horse from Washington, D.C., from the Pentagon, from the State Department, from either side of the political aisle, that tells me that the systemic problems that we're talking about here are going to be addressed. And when you look at and again, I am not, I'm actually an optimist. I'm not trying to come across as, doom and gloom. However, I'm also a career Green Beret who looks at civil society and who looks at indicators and warning signs of when the dashboard is blinking, right? That's what I've done for years in other places. And I'm telling you, the dashboard is blinking in this country in terms of the levels of distrust that we have in America, where 2/3 of Americans don't trust their neighbor. The proliferation of social media, I believe, is running us off a cliff, where we are treating each other's with shadow tribalism. And you see that kind of divisionist behavior in social media. You see it in the 24-hour news cycle. I see it all the time when I go on the news and I look at the level of professional division that's being fomented, certainly by our politicians. And so I think it starts with us as citizens. We have to look at ourselves and go, all right, as I look at my family, am I leading myself? Am I leading my family? Am I leading my community? And then from there, am I leading out? And, if you're wondering, well, what could I ever do about it? If you want to see an example of that, there's 2 books out there by Robert Putnam. One is called Bowling Alone, and the other is called The Upswing. And in both of those, the award-winning sociologist Robert Putnam talks about a time in the early 1900s when America was at a very, very dark place. She was divided. There was a real disparity between the haves and the have-nots. Infrastructure was falling apart. There was mass migration from the agricultural areas in the cities. The cities were sweltering with crime. There was unchecked immigration and just a whole range of civil society problems. And the pundits were all saying that America was on her last leg. This was it. We weren't going to make it. And then between 1890 and 1910, 1915, some very, very interesting thing happened. One of them was an alcoholic named Dr. Bob, and another alcoholic named Bill W. In Ohio decided to have a meeting because they couldn't get sober. Nobody else was coming. So they said, let's have a meeting. And that meeting ultimately transformed into Alcoholics Anonymous that has saved millions of addicts and alcoholics, including myself, and given them a pathway into recovery. At the same time, the Rotary Club, the Junior League, the Future Farmers of America, NAACP, pretty much every community-based organization that you and I grew up with as kids started during that window of time. It was the largest period of reform and community-based bottom-up leadership that we've ever seen on record. And it ran that social capital, that bridging social capital ran all the way until 1972. And that's what Putnam calls the upswing. And then in 1972, for a range of reasons, everything from Vietnam to mass technology and other things, it started to dip, and it has continued to be on a downswing until now. And the downswing, according to Putnam and other social scientists, is at an all-time low. And what we're seeing around us, in fact, when Putnam writes The Upswing, his first chapter, he describes what's going on, and you think, I'm sorry, I'm tipping the hand here, you think he's talking about now, but he wasn't. He's talking about 1905.
Interesting.
And so what Putnam's point is that we are at that inflection point where we are due another upswing. We are due that kind of bottom-up, community-based leadership that will force the institutional mechanisms to follow suit as it did in that period of time. There is macro-level precedent for it. I believe personally that what happened in the collapse of Afghanistan, and that you saw in these veterans-based organizations like Sacred Promise, Moral Compass, Dunkirk, Pineapple, was the first shot across the bow in a bottom-up community-based volunteer effort to deal with a social problem. If you look around, there's other things like that happening. So this goes back to your point about, do we take the microphone? Yes, I believe we have to take the microphone. The difference between now and that period of time in the early 1900s that ushered in this profound social reform is that we have access to platforms like yours,
like this one,
on an unprecedented scale, where our voices can actually be heard. Last Out, that play that we're doing right now that is being featured by Gary Sinise, that started with me just moving the pen sitting beside my wife writing a play at 48 years old. I didn't even start acting until I was 50. We put 28,000 miles on a U-Haul van to go around the country to 16 cities, right? That's how that started. Operation Pineapple Express, it started with two guys on a cell phone communicating on Signal saying, who else do we know and what else can we do? And sending emails to Fox News saying, you guys got it wrong. CNN, you need to bring somebody on that can talk about it. Like, the point is, we have access to platforms now that can usher in and mobilize this kind of change. And I believe it's possible. That's where it starts. I think people need to look around their arena. And I hate long answers to questions. I'm sorry I've done it, but people need to look around their arena and see what's laying on the ground that's stinking like cheese and say, all right, nobody's coming. What do I need to do to pick it up?
I agree. I absolutely 100% agree. I have I actually coined your term in my office with my team about the nobody is coming, because we've had a lot of reduced manning lately, and I've tried many avenues to get more people, and I just find, and I joked with one of my coworkers. I said, nobody's coming. We're just going to figure out how to make it work. And you know what? If we got to reduce our level of services or say, hey, we'll do that, but not at the level that you're asking for. But what we can do is that's just what we're going to do. And I think that you really have to take on that mentality when you're pushing for change and for growth in a community. So I've just thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I know we're getting at the top of the hour, but I want to make sure that we get out everything that I wanted for so many months to talk with you about. And I think I do want to transition back to Pineapple Express and just ask you how did you even start that? I'm just curious. I'm always curious about the sparks of change. So what were the first indicators? Was it you seeing something on the news? Was it the text from your friend who was the translator who's saying, I can't get out, I can't get out? Because I did read your book, and I love the way it's written. It's written from that perspective of that, from that issue with your friend, and then kind of goes out further into the larger issue of that incident. And so I always love to know the beginning of change. And so what happened to enable that rescue to take place?
I think, like everything else, it happened in my life that ended up being strategic. It started around failure. It started around struggle. It started around a tap on the shoulder, where my dear friend Nizam, a commando, a U.S. trained Special Forces NCO, weapons sergeant, was being hunted and frankly didn't have many more hours left on the earth. And I had tried to not get involved again because of the reasons we talked about when I got out of the Army. And I was working his visa on the edges, but kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And it was when Kabul finally collapsed. And he was talking to me, and he said, I don't mind dying. I just don't want to die alone. And that just hit me so hard. And it just made me realize that this was a kid that had been shot through the face defending U.S. Green Berets. And here he was, going to be executed, hung from a lamppost somewhere in Kabul because he had stood up for us. And I just couldn't live with that. I couldn't live with that. And that's what prompted me to reach out to a couple of buddies, some active duty, some not, but we all shared a love of Nizam. And we started just working a plan like so many others did. This wasn't just me. There was nothing unique about what I did.
Chat group. You guys did it through cell phones and chat groups.
Absolutely. And relationships and human connection. And that's why, like my whole thing with Rooftop Leadership about human connection, the message that I try to tell people is that at least what we did with Pineapple and what all these other groups did was they leveraged trust and relationships that had been built when risk was low. And then they called in those cards when risk was high. And that's the way humans work. When we build relationships and social capital when risk is low, then we can leverage it when risk is high. And that's what we did. And we were able to get some out, not enough. And then we were able to parlay that into, I think what Pineapple maybe did differently than some other groups was we told the story. That's when I recognized that, okay, I'm a storyteller. I'm going to tell the story from the stage in a play. I'm going to tell the story on CNN, Fox News. I'm going to write a book, and I'm going to get as loud as I need to get, because at the end of the day, this is wrong. And this is something that we, not only is it wrong, but we can learn from it. If you read the last words of my book in Pineapple, it's about, all right, what's your Pineapple Express?
Right.
That was ours. What's yours? And it goes back to this thing we talked about that Putnam described in the early 1900s, is that this is a time for citizen leadership, and we have everything we need at our disposal to lead, and the others, the mouth breathers, will follow suit if we do that.
They will. And I agree with you. You need the people like yourself who are the sparks and who lead the change, like Andy Milburn, like Brett Crozer, who I just had on, Captain Crozier. You need those people who can push change and who understand and understand what it takes to push change and have the confidence and the determination to do so. But then others will follow suit once you do that. And thank you so much. Is there anything else that I didn't ask you within this hour that you want to put out to the audience?
I think I would just say, if anybody's interested in the kind of stuff we're doing from the play to roof, just go to scottmann.com. It's got everything there. My TED Talks, my podcast. We talk a lot about this on my podcast, this operationalizing the upswing that you and I hit, and how to do that at your own level. And then I would encourage people to also, if you can, come see the play Last Out, Elegy of a Green Beret, while it's touring. It ends in October. If you go to lastoutplay.com, you can find the tour dates. It's a really powerful show, whether you served in the military or not. If you can't do that, you can watch it on Amazon Prime. It's there right now, in spite of the writers and actors strike. Last Out's there, and you can watch it on Amazon, and all the proceeds go to our nonprofit, The Hero's Journey. So, and the last thing is, again, if you see something around you that you know is broken and it needs to be fixed, is to just say to yourself, nobody's coming, and step into the arena and start leading. And people are starving for individuals who do that. We are looking for leaders who do that. If you don't have a title, don't worry about it. Just get in there and do what you know to be right, and tell the story, and people will come alongside.
I love it, Scott. All right. I'm going to say goodbye to you backstage real quick, but thank you so much for taking your time to come on the show today and share your story, share what people can do. It's so inspiring. It's a message, like you said, that needs to be heard. So thank you very much. I very much appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thanks, Teresa. Keep doing what you're doing too.
Thank you. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you all for joining me. I don't think we'll have a show next week, but I will be on a couple weeks later. So just please stay in touch. Please be sure to subscribe if you're following me from YouTube or on any of my other platforms. And thank you all for your support. Have a great rest of your weekend. Bye-bye now.